The 1981 German film Das Boot follows the crew of a German U-boat during World War II, at a time when there is already a sense that the Germans are on the losing side of the war. More and more U-boats are being sunk or captured, and U-96 is just one of the dwindling number of U-boats that sets out to sea again. And like Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, we watch them fight an increasingly hopeless battle, as they suffer through many things, conquering even seemingly impossible obstacles, and returning to port as changed men. At which point, they are attacked by Allied aircraft and everyone dies and the movie ends. Yeah, okay, not everyone dies, but many of the people we've come to sympathize with over the course of the film do die, making all of their nail-biting efforts at survival seem pointless, and we are left with what seems to be an ultimately tragic and pessimistic ending. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's important to begin our analysis of Das Boot by talking about the end. One of the unique contributions of this film, especially at the time of its release, was that it gave us a glimpse into the bad guys of World War II. It showed us the German point of view in a sympathetic way. And while at first we might feel hesitant to identify with soldiers fighting on the side of Nazi Germany, Das Boot shows us that while the Nazi Party was unquestionably evil and the German High Command was certainly responsible for crimes against humanity, the average German citizen was a more complicated story. Not every German was a Nazi, nor did every German like the Nazis. And the ultimately tragic ending of this film reminds us that it wasn't just the nations which Hitler invaded that were victims of the Nazis. In many ways, the German people themselves were victims of this dictator, including those who served in the German military. This conclusion is built up for us over the course of the film, as the U-boat captains continuously criticize the Nazi High Command, not only for the emerging failure of the battle in the Atlantic, but for the suffering that the U-boat crew inflicts on others. Thematically, I think Das Boot is really about suffering, portraying an experiment to sound out the limits of a person's ability to suffer, specifically in the form of suffering that was actually experienced by men living and fighting aboard a German U-boat. The film is about more than that, but I think we'll be able to see that better once we pick apart the plot. The film begins in France, where the crew members of various U-boats are partying it up something fierce. The absolute debauchery of the opening scenes is the proverbial last meal, before descending not into the earth in death, but descending into the sea, into something that is very like death. And after all, there is a very good chance that most of these men will not return to shore. A fact we knew from the very title sequence of the film, which tells us that of 40,000 U-boat men who served during World War II, 30,000 did not return. And now we are wondering how many of these men are about to join that number. The captain of our U-boat obviously does not partake in the rowdiness, but neither does he put the kibosh on it. He brushes off the fact that his own drunken crew members urinate on his car and act like fools. As he passes a group of submariners who are going out to seek some women of the night, he explains matter-of-factly that they are scared. This is simply how they cope with fear. For these young, inexperienced Germans, their fear is a fear of the unknown, a premonition of unseen things on the horizon. But for the grizzled old U-boat captains who have been out to sea, they do know what's coming, and they are drunk and grim respectively because they have experienced those horrors, and one of them at least is about to relive those horrors again. The rest of the first act of the film is really concerned with establishing the strangeness and discomfort of life on board a U-boat itself. Naval warfare aside, the mere fact of sailing on a submersible boat is a kind of shallow hell. And here it's worth remembering that the film is, after all, called Das Boot. As unremarkable as it may seem to simply title a film The Boat, It reminds us that the film is very much about the submarine itself. As the camera walks the length of the vessel, the word boat is flooded with meaning. It becomes synonymous with claustrophobia and stinking unsanitary conditions. Men have to share beds, one sleeping as the other works. There is no personal space, and there's but one single toilet for an entire crew. Without showers or baths, even bathing oneself is an ordeal. Perhaps the worst part of it all is the psychological aspect. The boredom of routine, waiting and waiting, nothing happening. As the U-boat scurries the Atlantic Ocean looking for a convoy to attack, looking for that needle in a haystack, the monotony is absolutely relentless and brutal, an aspect which you only really appreciate if you watch the 6-part miniseries that was released in 1985. As the U-boat skirts across the surface of the ocean, the oblivion of routine is like limbo, the first level of hell. Always desiring, but never having any satisfaction. It seems like anything would be better than this endless cycle. So when the word is finally given that a convoy has been spotted and the attack is on, the crew are elated. But in reality, this next step in their journey will only prove to be the next level of a deeper hell. The U-boat attempts to attack a destroyer during bad weather. The attempt fails, and the submarine is forced to dive. The destroyer attempts to sink the U-boat by maneuvering over the top of it and dropping depth charges into the sea over top of the U-boat. As these watery bombs drop all around them, the crew are helpless. They can try to dive deeper or outmaneuver the destroyer, but like a game of hide and seek, every sound they make can give away their position. Now it gets psychological, says the captain, and indeed it does. This is where Das Boot really sinks into its own as a suspense horror film. And it does what very few other war films, at least that I've seen, have equaled, which is to create an agonizing, unsurpassed sense of tension. And it achieves this tension primarily in two ways. First, with sound. And you guys know I'm a sucker for a film with good sound design. And with Das Boot, it's simple but effective. It's about listening for the sound of that destroyer cutting through the water, spinning its propellers overhead, coming to drop death on the submerged U-boat. Suspense ebbs and flows with the level of the sound. As it grows louder, the threat and horror increases. And the only thing to do to try and survive is to dive deeper. And this introduces the second device of suspense, the visuals, which in turn rely most heavily on two kinds of shots. The first being a close-up shot of this depth gauge, which indicates not only how deep the U-boat is, but how deep it can go before being crushed by the increasing pressure of the ocean. We watch as it inches closer and closer to the dangerous depth indicated by the red. And again, sound kicks in as the boat creaks and groans under the increasing pressure pressing against the hull. But the real bedrock of this film is the close-up shots of the faces of the U-boat men themselves. The tightness of the shots in itself tells us as much, if not more, about war in the close spaces of a submarine than any exposition ever could. With these close-ups, we feel the discomfort, and our bodies feel cramped as well. And by focusing on the face, the story becomes about the terror and horror going on not just in the U-boat, but in each man. In moments where there can be no screams, no cries, no dialogue, no exposition, no speaking at all, the story must be told exclusively in the faces. And what a story these faces tell. The suspense keeps ratcheting up as we wait and wait and wait, and then suddenly the charges drop. Chaos erupts. The sound design again becomes a symphony of pandemonium. But gradually, composure is regained, and the process is repeated. Suspense, chaos, recovery, as the destroyer keeps coming around again and again to depth charge the U-boat. And each time, the stakes grow as we wonder, is this the time they get a direct hit? Is this the one that will turn the U-boat into a coffin? Thankfully, not this time. The U-boat is able to evade the destroyer, and when it does finally return to the surface, the war correspondent narrates, "We have returned from hell." But no sooner had they escaped one hell than another returns. They have only risen back to the level of limbo, once again faced with boredom as well as stormy seas. The war correspondent complains, "It's an experiment to sound out the limits of our ability to suffer." Again, the story is told in faces, but this time in faces of blank boredom rather than pain or fear. It's interesting that many of the most extreme forms of punishment that the human imagination can conjure up are marked by repetitiveness, whether we're talking about the recurring punishments of Dante's Inferno, or Prometheus having his liver grow back every night only to have it eaten again every day, or Sisyphus always pushing up his rock. And it's a testimony to Das Boot's storytelling that even though the film is about to repeat its events, it never feels the same. In fact, every repetition feels worse, like we are descending to a new level of hell with worse punishments. The U-boat moves in again for the hunt, and this time attacking an entire convoy of ships. But again they are spotted by a destroyer, again they quickly dive, and again the cat and mouse game begins. Again, it's our ears that tell us we are in for something worse than before, as the ping of a sonar signal cuts the air. And it's the faces, rather than the dialogue, that confirm for us that the U-boat crew knows exactly what this means. The enemy has a new tool that can more easily reveal the U-boat's location. There's nowhere to hide. They are up against the wall, fish in a barrel. And thus the attack on the U-boat is more intense. The damage to the U-boat is more severe. Desperately, they dive so deep that rivets shoot out of the hull. Many of the men break down, weeping, and one of them has a complete psychological break, leaving his station and attempting to escape, even though no escape is possible. The Inferno is a fundamentally incoherent and illogical place, as well as a hopeless place. As they hear the destroyer coming back for another attack, the captain almost doesn't care, and the war correspondent collapses on his bunk in what must be something of a despairing swoon as voices cry out, "We are sinking." Just as the entrance to Dante's hell is marked by the sign to abandon hope, Das Boot builds up over the course of the film with a series of increasingly hopeless situations. And when the war correspondent wakes from his swoon, they are, against all odds, still alive. Yes, the U-boat survived their third hell, but only to be faced with a fourth one, even more hopeless than the last. It can be hard sometimes to pin down exactly what separates a good movie from a great one. But with Das Boot, I think one of the factors that makes it a great film is its sense of build-up and premonition, which I've been trying to map out. It almost follows horror movies rather than standard war films, in that, from the beginning, there's a slight premonition that something bad is coming, and once that something bad does come, there's always a sense of something worse on the horizon. And it never subsides. It keeps us constantly engaged, even in a movie that largely takes place in a few hundred square feet. When the captain receives orders to take the U-boat to a port in Italy, the film immediately establishes that what is about to come is worse than anything we've experienced yet. This is reinforced for us not only by the crew interaction, but by the refueling and resupplying scene in Vigo, Spain. First of all, the scene affords the chance for the war correspondent and the chief engineer to get off the boat and hopefully get smuggled through Spain back to Germany. The unspoken implication is that it is very likely the U-boat will not survive the upcoming mission. Secondly, this scene provides a contrast between the U-boat officers and the officers of the German ship resupplying them. The gross and disheveled submariners versus the immaculately dressed surface sailors. I don't always give enough credit to costume, hair, and makeup, but here they are doing all of the heavy lifting, continuing to tell the story not so much in words, but in soiled shirts and in the lines of these faces. Those of us who aren't fluent in German don't need the subtitles to understand what's going on. Even without any sound at all, the visuals would tell us everything we need to know. This is truly cinema as painting. And even beyond this scene, the gritty hair and makeup are what, in visual terms, put Das Boot in a class above other films of its kind. Unfortunately, this brief heaven does not last. The request for the chief and the war correspondent to go ashore is denied, and so they and we are along for the suicide mission to the Strait of Gibraltar. Long story short, as they are attempting to enter the strait under cover of darkness, the U-boat is spotted by a plane and attacked, both from the air and the sea. The damaged submarine is forced to dive, but the diving planes are stuck in a downward position, sending the U-boat in a downward trajectory that the crew is unable to arrest. As they helplessly sink deeper and deeper, watching the pressure gauge rise, it seems like the end. Until they unexpectedly strike ground on a sandy shelf, still miraculously in one piece. They are alive, but the vessel is leaking badly, so they are forced to work desperately at pumping out water and making repairs, all while their supply of oxygen is being consumed. The clock is ticking. It's during this climactic sequence that we can really reflect on what the film is about. As many of the crew are asleep in their bunks in order to consume as little oxygen as possible, the war correspondent and the captain are sitting quietly together in the belly of the proverbial whale, faced with almost certain death. And the captain simply says, "I'm sorry." The war correspondent responds unexpectedly, saying that he wanted this to happen, to face the relentless truth, where no one's mother is there to take care of them, no woman crosses their path for them to flex at. He wanted to go where only reality reigns, ferocious and great, with cruelty and grandeur. Of course, before all of this happened, he didn't really know what these words meant. He says that he was drunk on those words. They impaired his judgment. But now, he's sober. Now he can think straight. This is reality. And this reality is something far more horrifying than he could have imagined. In a sense, the war correspondent is following in the steps of Achilles, who, when he was alive, chose to have a short life with great glory in war. But when he is dead, he says to Odysseus, "No winning words about death to me, shining Odysseus. By God, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt-poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over the breathless dead." Thankfully, the U-boat crew are walking the path more of Odysseus rather than Achilles, because like Odysseus, they will get to return from their Hades. When the chief engineer reports that the necessary repairs have been made, and that they are ready to blow out the water in the tanks and attempt to rise to the surface, the captain simply says, "Good. All you need is good men. Good men." When I said before that Das Boot is about more than just suffering, this is what I meant. Ultimately, Das Boot is about good, solid men overcoming the impossible. If I were to venture an attempt at summarizing the impact of Das Boot in a statement that balances all of its elements, I'd say that the film is on the one hand about de-romanticizing what it means to be a good man. It wants to demystify romantic notions of heroism and glory and war, but it also honors what men are able to endure and accomplish when they are plunged into the depths of a living hell. Das Boot is about grace under pressure. It's about a captain who can bitterly insist against any ideas of glory and war, and insist that men are able to be dignified even under the worst circumstances. And it's about the fact that even men who lose their dignity and break like Johann are able to redeem themselves. The point which seems the most hopeless, where one's very mind is broken by something outside his control, robbing him even of his ability to think. Even this can be overcome. Whatever its attitude to war, I consider Das Boot to be a profoundly pro-human film. A film that is on the side not only of the preciousness of human life, but the power of the human spirit. Inevitably, people will look at the same thing, watch the same movie, and see something different. Some will see Das Boot simply as another anti-war film, because some will only see in one dimension. And when a bad thing is portrayed, such eyes can only see something to be avoided at all costs. For them, every film is an anti-war film. On the other hand, Roger Ebert quotes Francois Truffaut as saying that it is impossible to make an anti-war film, because films tend to make war look exciting. And Ebert said that this theory does not hold true of Das Boot, that Das Boot does not make war look exciting. But personally, I think Ebert was only halfway correct in this. Yes, Das Boot shows us the horror of war, and it convinces us that war should be avoided whenever possible. And yet, the moment the crew turns on those diesel engines, and the elation of the music and the defiance of the captain scream into the night, if this is supposed to be an anti-war moment, it's not doing a very good job of it. Far from making us feel bad, far from any sadness or pity, it is a moment of supreme involuntary elation. It's a high, where if we don't forget the war completely, if there is any time for any analysis at all, we realize that it would be impossible to reach this heaven without first treading hell. If the main theme of the soundtrack can give us any indication as to the main theme of the whole film, it's that the film is about rising. Rising circuitously and with backward steps, but still rising to the surface, above even the tonic at which you began. Faced with something that one cannot avoid, this film is about overcoming.